The village of Lochdu had rarely seen excitement beyond the occasional sheep wandering onto the main street, or the odd tourist lost on the narrow, winding roads. That morning, however, a fog hung low over the heather, carrying with it an air of something unspoken, something that would unsettle even the most stoic residents. Hamish Macbeth, the village constable, was sipping his first cup of tea when the call came, a voice over the radio, tight and anxious, reporting a most unusual incident at the mansion of Sir Alister Mackenzie, the oldest and most respected figure in the Highlands. Hamish arrived at the sprawling estate, its stone walls darkened by dampness, the garden gates swaying in the wind as if echoing the unease within. Sir Alister's study was a room lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes and heavy oak furniture. There, sprawled across the Persian rug, lay Sir Alister himself, his eyes wide but lifeless, a thin line of blood marring his otherwise pristine collar. The first thing Hamish noticed, and the thing that made his brow crease in puzzlement, was the envelope resting beside the body. It was small, yellowed, and sealed with an unusual wax stamp depicting a raven, yet the contents had been meticulously removed. No note, no message, just the empty envelope, brr. He room bore no signs of forced entry. Windows were locked, doors bolted from the inside. Not a single object appeared displaced. A half-finished cup of tea on the side table, a pair of reading glasses resting atop an open ledger. It all suggested the mundane comfort of a quiet morning rather than the scene of a murder. Yet Sir Alister was dead, and the subtle evidence left behind whispered a riddle that would take every ounce of Hamish's cunning to unravel. He crouched beside the body, studying the peculiar arrangement of items. A silver paper knife gleamed faintly in the soft morning light. It seemed ordinary, yet there was a trace of red, not fresh blood, but a smear that suggested it had been wiped clean. Hamish's mind raced. Did the killer attempt to stage the scene, or was this some cryptic message meant to mislead any would-be investigator? He glanced at the ledger, its pages open to a mundane record of accounts, yet a single word had been penciled in the margin. Trust, bar. Trust, Hamish murmured under his breath. The word resonated with the reputation Sir Alister held, a man universally trusted in Lochdu, whose advice and judgment were beyond reproach. Whoever had committed this crime had struck at the very symbol of certainty in the village, yet left behind a clue so obtuse it could mean everything or nothing at all. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, pulling Hamish's attention toward the door. Inspector MacLeod from Inverness, an imposing figure with a reputation for meticulous method, stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the room with practiced scrutiny. "Bah, Macbeth," he said, his voice clipped. "I trust you've secured the scene?" But Hamish nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. "Aye, Inspector, but I've never seen anything like this. No signs of a struggle, no message, nothing that points to motive or suspect. Just this." He gestured toward the empty envelope and the word penciled in the ledger. Bar MacLeod's gaze narrowed. "Curious," he said softly. "Too neat, too precise. It's as if the killer wanted us to find nothing, yet leave us something to puzzle over. Classic misdirection or a warning." The investigation began in earnest, and Hamish moved methodically through the study, noting every minor detail. The faint scuff on the rug's edge, the slight tilt of a chair, the way the curtains hung heavier on one side, almost as though someone had brushed past them hastily. Nothing overt, yet everything could speak volumes if one only knew how to listen. He interviewed the household staff, all of whom were visibly shaken, yet each seemed to have an airtight alibi. The cook had been in the kitchen, the butler in the pantry, the gardener tending the frost-bitten lawn. And yet, a sense of something unseen permeated the room, a tension that suggested the killer was closer than anyone suspected. Hamish returned to the envelope. He turned it over, feeling the texture of the wax seal, noting how it bore no fingerprints but seemed to carry an almost deliberate weight. He knew Sir Alister had many dealings, financial, political, personal, and the list of those who might wish him harm was, for a man of his stature, surprisingly long. Yet none seemed obvious. None had motive that could explain such a meticulous act. As he stepped back, Hamish allowed himself a rare moment of contemplation. This crime was too deliberate, too enigmatic for a mere act of passion or revenge. It was a puzzle designed to confound, and perhaps in some subtle way to communicate. Somewhere in the cold, shadowed corners of Sir Alister's mansion lay the thread that, if followed, would unravel the identity of the most trusted man's killer. Hamish Macbeth felt the familiar stir of anticipation, that quiet thrill that came when the solution was just beyond reach, waiting for the patient eye to see what others could not. And in that still, fog-laden morning, with the village of Lochdu holding its collective breath, Hamish knew that this was only the beginning. The unsolvable crime had planted its seeds, and somewhere among the whispers of the mansion's walls, the first clues to the mystery waited, biding their time. Hamish Macbeth spent the rest of the morning moving through the mansion with the quiet precision that had earned him his reputation, while Inspector MacLeod busied himself directing the constables, taking notes, and issuing standard orders to secure evidence. Hamish allowed his attention to wander to subtler details. He noticed the way the sunlight struck the dust motes in the library, revealing fine scratches along the edge of a desk that didn't match the usual wear. Small things, easily overlooked, a faint smudge on the windowsill, as though someone had gripped it while peering outside, the faint scent of tobacco lingering in a room that had no visitor known to smoke, the tilt of a family portrait that seemed ever so slightly off-centre. His servants had been questioned already, each offering their statements with an anxious sincerity that Hamish could almost feel as a physical weight in the air. Yet one of them, Margaret, the maid who had been with Sir Alister for over a decade, displayed a flicker of hesitation. She recounted finding the body that morning with an insistence bordering on rehearsed, yet her eyes kept drifting toward the fireplace, where an ashtray had been moved just enough to leave a faint ring of soot on the polished floor. Hamish crouched beside it, noting the subtle shift in perspective it implied. Someone had arrived before her, someone who had lingered and perhaps fumbled with the room's arrangement. Tea was in the study's corner, that Hamish noticed the first truly peculiar object, a small, intricately carved chess piece, a black knight, lying far from the board on the floor. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hand. No one else had mentioned it, and yet it seemed deliberately placed, almost as if it had been dropped to be found. The knight didn't belong there. The chessboard was set neatly in the centre of the room, untouched. A misstep, a signal, or a taunt. It was impossible to tell, but instinct told Hamish that the piece was more than accidental. As he examined the object, Hamish's attention shifted to the ledger again. The penciled word trust seemed to weigh heavier now, its meaning amplifying the strangeness of the empty envelope and the misplaced chess piece. Could it be that the killer had a game in mind, a deliberate pattern, a message encoded in the mundane? Hamish's eyes swept over the walls, the floor, the shelves. Nothing yet suggested the full shape of the crime, but every detail hinted that someone had carefully staged appearances while leaving, subtle markers for those observant enough to notice. Hamish moved into the hallway, listening to the hushed whispers of the household. A servant muttered about how quiet Sir Alister had been in the days prior. Another mentioned a visitor who had arrived, late one evening, and left as quietly as they had come. He asked Margaret to recount the visitor's features again, and this time her description was vague, uncertain, as if she were filling in gaps where memory faltered. Hamish filed the inconsistencies in his mind, noting that deception often revealed itself in the edges of certainty, in hesitation and overemphasis, and he could sense both in her manner. The kitchen offered another subtle clue. Hamish noticed a set of cups slightly out of alignment, one with a faint lipstick mark, though no female guest had been recorded for the morning. The cook insisted she had not touched them, but Hamish could see the tension in her hands, the way she avoided his gaze as he casually leaned against the counter. He wondered if these small disturbances were red herrings, or perhaps tiny windows into a larger pattern. By the time the afternoon shadows lengthened across the estate, Hamish had catalogued every anomaly: the smudged windowsill, the tilted portrait, the ash-marked floor, the chess piece, the hesitant testimony, the faint scent of tobacco, the lipstick-marked cup. Individually, each could be dismissed as an accident. Together, they painted a picture that suggested intention, careful orchestration, and above all, cunning. MacLeod, meanwhile, had moved methodically, making sure the constables took fingerprints, logged every drawer, and double-checked the locked doors. He remained focused on procedure, satisfied with the orderly accumulation of evidence, but he did not see what Hamish already suspected. That The crime was less about the act itself than about the message it carried. Someone had committed murder with deliberate symbolism, challenging those left behind to piece together a puzzle that was only partially revealed. Hamish felt the familiar stir of anticipation that always preceded a breakthrough. The patterns were faint, hidden in plain sight, waiting for him to discern the logic behind the apparent chaos. He tucked the black knight into his coat pocket, resolved to follow the subtle breadcrumbs wherever they led. In the quiet, brooding mansion of Sir Alister Mackenzie, it was clear that the most trusted man of Lochdoe had been felled not only by violence, but by a mind intent on leaving a trail, and Hamish Macbeth, with his patient eye and uncanny perception, would be the one to follow it. Hamish Macbeth had spent the morning observing, noting details that suggested deliberate deception, and now it was time to turn his attention to the people who might hold answers, or be hiding them. He began with Margaret, the maid whose hesitancy had first drawn his notice. She repeated her account carefully, almost too carefully, describing the moment she discovered Sir Alister's body. Yet as she spoke, Hamish noticed tiny inconsistencies. One moment she claimed to have been in the pantry for several minutes, then later corrected herself to say it was barely a minute. She insisted she had not touched the ashtray, yet her sleeve bore a faint smudge of soot. Next, Hamish spoke with the butler, Mr. Wallace, a man whose stoicism often concealed a sharp mind. Wallace recounted seeing nothing unusual when he arrived to prepare Sir Alister's morning tea, yet Hamish noticed the way he lingered on certain details, the unusual angle of the curtains, the open ledger, the empty envelope. Wallace's voice was calm, but it lacked certainty. His insistence that he had touched nothing seemed more defensive than honest. Hamish made a mental note. Calmness was easy to feign. Subtle defensiveness was far harder to mask. The cook, Mrs. MacLaren, proved equally revealing. She insisted she had been entirely occupied in the kitchen. Yet Hamish noticed the faintest traces of lipstick on one of the cups near the tea service. When he asked about it, her reaction was just slightly too sharp, a flicker of irritation that suggested she had expected no one to notice. She claimed she had seen no visitors that morning, yet had not mentioned preparing tea for any outside guest. The omission was small, but in Hamish's experience, the smallest details often concealed the largest truths. Then Sir Alister's nephew, Andrew Mackenzie, who had arrived later to hear the news, offered a version of events that was suspiciously neat. He emphasized how orderly the house had been, how shocked he was by the news, yet Hamish observed a twitch of impatience when he was asked if he had recently visited the estate. Andrew claimed to have been away on business, but could not immediately recall the exact town he had travelled to. It was a minor lapse, almost imperceptible, but Hamish's mind catalogued it as the sort of issue that could be widened under careful questioning. As Hamish continued, he noticed how the different accounts began to intersect in curious ways. Margaret and Wallace's timelines conflicted over who had been in the hallway first. Mrs. MacLaren's account of the tea service did not align precisely with the ledger recorded entries. Andrew's vague recollection of his travel left a hole that none of the others could fill. Individually, each inconsistency might be dismissed as human error, but Hamish knew that coincidences rarely appeared in a case so meticulously staged. The discrepancies were too patterned, too deliberate, to be accidental. Hamish allowed each person to speak freely, watching their expressions and listening to the cadence of their words. Some were eager to cooperate, almost excessively so, offering details before he could even ask. Others held back, choosing their words carefully, revealing only fragments. Both behaviours were instructive. Over-eagerness often masked guilt, a desire to control the narrative, while reticence suggested concealment or fear. Every subtle twitch, every hesitation, every overemphasized reassurance carried meaning. Returning to the study, Hamish examined the room anew with the suspect's statements echoing in his mind. The black knight in his pocket seemed to carry a renewed weight, almost as if it symbolized the careful maneuvering of those around him. Whoever had committed this crime had anticipated scrutiny, and had constructed a network of deception that played out not only in objects and placement, but in the very words of the witnesses themselves. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of being inside the mind of someone cunning, yet he also sensed that the truth, though obscured, had left tiny, deliberate cracks, flaws in the pattern that only patience and careful observation could reveal. Why, late afternoon, the threads of the St. Ori were beginning to take shape, though only in the faintest outline. The inconsistencies among the household staff, the small evasions of Andrew, the odd placement of objects in the study, all suggested a mind that had orchestrated not just a murder, but a performance. Hamish knew that if he was to uncover the killer, he would need to untangle both the physical clues and the tangled web of human deception, reading between the lines of words and gestures. The stage was set, the players in motion, and the quiet village of Lochdu held its breath as the detective, alert and patient, prepared to follow the hidden motives wherever they might lead. Hamish Macbeth spent the evening poring over the tangled threads of the day's interviews, the statements swirling in his mind like fog over Lochdu. Each suspect seemed to carry a fragment of a possible motive, yet no single theory could account for the complexity of the scene. Margaret's nervous glances and hesitations suggested loyalty strained by fear. Fear of reprisal, perhaps, or of revealing a secret she had carried too long. Wallace, the butler, had the calmness of a man who prided himself on control, yet the subtle defensiveness in his answers hinted at knowledge he was unwilling to disclose. Mrs. MacLaren's sharp reactions to seemingly trivial observations indicated embarrassment or guilt, and Andrew Mackenzie, with his carefully rehearsed alibi and the almost imperceptible impatience in his voice, offered the vaguest hints of something unresolved in his relationship with his uncle. But Eid was an obvious thread. Sir Alister's estate was substantial, with holdings and investments that could inspire envy or opportunism. Andrew stood to inherit, and though he had outwardly displayed respect for his uncle, the ease with which he had deflected questions about recent visits suggested a desire to obscure his proximity. Hamish undecided whether Andrew's trips were genuine or a convenient smokescreen. Wallace and Margaret, while less directly involved in financial matters, had long served the Mackenzies and could have been motivated by the promise of protection, reward, or personal gain if the estate's succession shifted in unexpected ways. Even Mrs. MacLaren, fiercely protective of her own position in the household, might have felt cornered, driven by the anxiety of losing standing or favour. There was more than wealth at stake. Revenge simmered quietly beneath the surface. Hamish remembered the cryptic penciled word in the ledger, trust. It suggested that the killer had a grievance rooted not just in material concerns but in betrayal. Had someone felt wronged by Sir Alister's judgment or actions? Perhaps a slight dismissed as trivial, a reprimand long past, yet enough to fester into a simmering vendetta. Every witness, even those seemingly loyal, carried the potential for resentment, whether open or buried. Hamish could sense it in Margaret's guarded phrasing, in Wallace's almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw, in Andrew's careful avoidance of any direct emotional reference to his uncle. Alizy added another layer to the maze. In a small village like Lochdu, relationships, both personal and professional, were closely intertwined. Hamish considered whether someone's affection or admiration had turned sour, whether a rivalry or unspoken rivalry had driven someone to orchestrate such a meticulous crime. The Black Knight still lay in his coat pocket, a piece that seemed to symbolize calculated maneuvering, a single piece in a larger game of human pride and ambition. But Befar, too, was a quiet but powerful motivator. Perhaps the killer acted preemptively, struck before some secret could be revealed, or before consequences for past misdeeds became unavoidable. Fear could explain the careful staging, the misleading envelope, the empty threats left behind, an attempt to control the narrative from beyond the act itself. Hamish thought of the slight smudge on the windowsill, the tilted portrait, the ash-marked floor. Each small trace suggested someone meticulous, someone who anticipated scrutiny and sought to manipulate perception. As the evening deepened into night, Hamish began to map out the connections between the household members, their potential motives, and their movements. He cross-referenced statements, noting where timelines overlapped or diverged. Margaret's nervous hesitations aligned with certain unexplained moments in the butler's recollection. Mrs. McLaren's apparent indignation coincided with subtle gaps in Andrew's story. The pieces were fragmented, a web of half-truths and omissions, yet patterns were emerging, faint but discernible. Hamish allowed himself a rare smile of cautious satisfaction. The threads were messy, but they were not random. Each suspect, each word, each hesitation contributed to the larger picture. He understood now that solving this crime would require more than examining physical evidence. It would demand unravelling the human entanglements that underpinned it, teasing apart greed, revenge, jealousy, and fear to reveal the single act that had shattered the calm of Lochdu. Closed the ledger, tucking the Black Knight into his pocket once more, and leaned back in the quiet study. The mansion was hushed now, shadows stretching long across the polished floor, but Hamish felt no unease. He had entered the labyrinth of motive and deception, and though the exit was not yet in sight, he could feel the contours of the path. Somewhere in the interplay of ambition and resentment, in the precise staging of objects and words, lay the identity of the person who had killed the most trusted man in Lochdu, and Hamish Macbeth, Patti. Perceptive and unyielding, would find it. Morning in Lochdu dawned clear and bright, a deceptive calm that contrasted sharply with the tension still lingering in Sir Alister's mansion. Hamish Macbeth had been reviewing the night's notes when a call came from Inspector MacLeod. A local delivery man had come forward, claiming he had seen a suspicious figure near the estate the previous evening. According to his account, a tall man in a dark coat had lingered near the garden gate shortly before nightfall. The man's description, though vague, seemed to point to Andrew Mackenzie. The inspector, already wary of Andrew's evasive manner, seized upon this tip with the eagerness of someone hungry for resolution. Mid-morning, Andrew had been taken aside for questioning. Hamish observed the proceedings with a quiet, sceptical eye. The constables treated the report as the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Andrew's stories faltered slightly under pressure, and MacLeod, interpreting every stammer and correction as evidence of guilt, declared that the case was effectively solved. He spoke with triumph, praising his own diligence, and the household, sensing closure, began to exhale after days of anxiety. Hamish felt no such satisfaction. Something about the delivery man's testimony did not sit right with him. The description was generic, almost too convenient, and Andrew's hesitation, while imperfect, did not match the meticulous nature of the crime. The letter in the envelope remained missing, the Black Knight and other subtle clues still unresolved. Hamish's instincts, honed over years of careful observation, whispered that they had been handed a false victory, a premature conclusion designed to relieve pressure without uncovering the truth. Ish returned to the study, retracing every detail with renewed attention: the tilted portrait, the ash-marked floor, faint tobacco scent, the misplaced chess piece, all remained anomalies untouched by the rush to judgment. He examined the ledger again. The penciled word trust seemed almost to pulse under the morning light, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. Hamish reflected on the web of motives he had mapped out: greed, jealousy, revenge, fear. None of these strands pointed neatly to Andrew, yet the authorities were already building their case as if all doubt had vanished. He visited Margaret once more, speaking in low tones while the household bustled around them. Her eyes were wide, her hands trembling, but her words hinted at knowledge that had gone unspoken. She mentioned, almost in passing, a visitor who had been seen entering the estate late the previous week, a man she could not describe in detail, but whose presence had been out of place, unexpected. Hamish noted the timing carefully. It overlapped with the period when the envelope had last been seen, and it suggested that the killer might have orchestrated a diversion to mislead the authorities. Hamish then moved to the library, examining the collection of books, letters, and personal effects for overlooked connections. He found a drawer slightly ajar, though no one had reported it missing. Inside were correspondence fragments, brief notes, a few with postmarks from towns far from Lochdu. One letter, partially torn, contained a reference to a financial transaction gone awry, and another hinted at a personal grievance. These fragments, while not incriminating on their own, suggested that someone had been systematically covering their tracks while leaving breadcrumbs for a careful observer. Hamish's suspicions deepened. The person who had killed Sir Alistair was not impulsive. They had planned for scrutiny, knowing the authorities would grasp at anything resembling a lead. Even the Black Knight now seemed to mow. The hastily drawn conclusion, its deliberate placement, the odd timing of its discovery, and the way it seemed almost symbolic of a hidden game all pointed to a mind several steps ahead of the official investigation. Hamish realized that the killer had allowed the authorities a small, believable clue precisely to create the illusion of progress, to lull everyone into a false sense of resolution. As he stepped back into the hall, Hamish's gaze swept over the mansion once more. The estate was alive with activity, police reports being typed, Andrew being led away for further questioning, but Hamish moved slowly, deliberately. He knew the danger of complacency. The real criminal remained in the shadows, watching, patient, and confident that their design had taken hold. The game was far from over. Hamish Macbeth, silent and calculating, felt the familiar thrill of the challenge, the early victory. It had been a trap, a feint, and he understood now that every instinct, every observation, every anomaly must be followed through. The true perpetrator had made a calculated choice, let the authorities taste triumph, then wait for the right moment to strike again. And Hamish, unhurried and vigilant, would be ready to uncover them when they did. Hamish Macbeth returned to the study late that afternoon, the fading sunlight spilling through the tall windows and casting long, angular shadows across the floor. The mansion, usually so orderly, felt oddly unsettled, as though the house itself remembered more than the people inside. Hamish's thoughts drifted back to the fragments of correspondence he had found, postmarked letters hinting at grievances and unsettled affairs, but one in particular nagged at him. It mentioned an event long ago, an inheritance dispute involving Sir Alistair's father, a man whose dealings had sown quiet tension among those now in the house. He pulled a drawer from the desk, now inspecting every piece of paper, every ledger, every scrap of parchment. Among old letters and invoices he discovered a yellowed, folded note, almost overlooked in the rush of modern documents. The handwriting was elegant, formal, yet heavy with emotion. It referenced a contract dispute involving the Mackenzie estate decades prior, a disagreement that had embroiled multiple local families. One name caught Hamish's eye, Wallace, the butler. It was a relative, it seemed, though Hamish could not immediately discern the exact connection. A knot of curiosity tightened in his chest. It was rare for personal disputes to resurface with such force, but when they did, they often carried long memories and grudges. Hamish's mind raced. Could the careful, controlled behaviour he had observed in Wallace be tied not only to loyalty or duty, but to old resentments? He recalled subtle cues from ear. Slyer, the slight defensive tightening of his jaw, the careful avoidance of certain questions, and now, with the note in hand, a thread began to unravel. Wallace had family ties tangled in the Mackenzies' history, a legacy of disputes, inheritances, and perceived slights. It was not enough to suggest motive outright, but combined with the careful staging of the crime and the misleading envelope, it hinted at a deeper, more calculated design than anyone had yet considered. Hamish revisited Margaret and Mrs. MacLaren quietly, questioning them again about the previous week. Margaret mentioned that Wallace had received unexpected visitors late at night, men she did not recognise, and that Wallace had seemed unusually tense afterward. Mrs. MacLaren, on the other hand, recalled overhearing hushed conversations in the library. Conversations that hinted at old debts and familial grudges. The pieces, once scattered, were starting to align. Wallace, the butler, had long-standing ties to a family history intertwined with Sir Alistair's fortunes, and these ties were more than abstract. They were personal, carrying resentment and opportunity. Andrew, Hamish realised, was linked in subtle ways to this past. His brief, almost imperceptible discomfort during questioning now seemed to make sense. The younger generation often inherited not only estates but the weight of old family quarrels. While he had outwardly appeared eager to protect his uncle's interests, There was a tension in his voice that suggested he too felt the undercurrents of a historical grievance. And Margaret and Mrs. Maclaren, long-time servants, were not simply witnesses. They had been silent observers of decades of hidden feuds, aware of loyalties and rivalries that no newcomer could immediately perceive. Hamish traced the connections carefully, mapping them in his mind like a constellational diagram. The seemingly random details of the present, the misplaced chess piece, the ash-marked floor, the mysterious envelope, suddenly gained clarity. They were part of a story that had been written long before the murder, one of old debts, hidden alliances and quiet vendettas that had festered in the shadows. The crime was not merely about wealth or the immediate grievances of those present. It was the culmination of generational tension, a carefully plotted strike that drew upon knowledge, loyalty and resentment, accumulated over decades. The detective moved to the fireplace, examining the hearth more closely. A faint mark on the stone caught his eye, almost imperceptible, but consistent with a small object having been placed there repeatedly. Hamish realized it could have been a deliberate signal, a way for someone to reference the past without speaking it aloud, a hidden signature of intent. The crime, the staging, even the false lead with Andrew, it all now seemed like a choreography, designed to exploit what the authorities would miss, the invisible weight of history shaping the present. Hamish stepped back, feeling the mansion's quiet press around him. Shadows stretched longer as the sun dipped lower, and he sensed that the revelation of past grievances was the key to unlocking the current mystery. The real killer was not acting solely out of greed or jealousy. It was someone who understood the intricate web of relationships spanning decades, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate trust and appearances, and in the subtle interplay of history and human nature, Hamish Macbeth could feel that the path to truth was now within reach, hidden in the echoes of the past waiting to be carefully uncovered. Hamish Macbeth had spent the morning retracing the web of past grievances and present inconsistencies, and now he felt the familiar need to provoke a reaction, to create a situation where the guilty could betray themselves without realizing it. The clues in the study, the Black Knight, the misaligned objects, and the scraps of letters were all pieces of a puzzle. Yet one crucial element remained elusive, the identity of the person who had orchestrated the murder with such meticulous care. He needed more than observation, he needed a response, a crack in the mask of civility each suspect wore so carefully. He gathered the household in the drawing room under guise of recounting the day's events and offering reassurance that the investigation was proceeding. His tone was casual, conversational, yet deliberately directed. He spoke of the crime as though it were a distant story, mentioning the Black Knight and the envelope, describing them in abstract terms almost as if they were minor curiosities rather than central pieces of evidence. He wanted to see who would twitch at the suggestion, who would feel the invisible sting of guilt. Margaret fidgeted subtly, her hands twisting in her apron. Mrs. Maclaren maintained her composure but bit her lower lip, a barely perceptible sign that her attention had been captured in an unusual way. Andrew appeared calm, though his eyes flickered once toward the corner where Hamish had placed the Black Knight on a side table. Then there was Wallace. He leaned back slightly, arms crossed, ostensibly relaxed, yet Hamish noted the tiniest narrowing of his eyes, a micro-expression that passed almost too quickly for anyone else to see. That fleeting moment was enough to confirm what Hamish already suspected. Wallace had more to hide than any of the others. Hamish proceeded with a subtle test, one of psychology rather than force. He spoke of a supposed clue, a letter that had been misplaced, never found in the study. He described its contents vaguely, implying it contained information that could implicate the murderer, informatio. That would finally settle the matter. He watched the room carefully. While the others responded with mild curiosity or polite interest, Wallace's hands tightened over his knees, and he shifted slightly forward in his chair, betraying a tension that the rest of the group did not share. His voice, when he spoke to ask a question about the letter, was too measured, too careful, and his eyes darted toward the fireplace where Hamish had noted the subtle mark the day before. Encouraged, Hamish pressed further, weaving hints into his observations. He mentioned that the killer had left a symbolic signature behind, a personal touch of some sort. Wallace's eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition, almost imperceptible, But Hamish had long since learned that the smallest gestures often spoke louder than words. Margaret glanced quickly at Wallace, almost imperceptibly, as if to measure his reaction, and Mrs. MacLaren's hands clenched briefly in her lap. Andrew shifted uneasily but said nothing. His discomfort was different, rooted in awareness rather than guilt. Hamish decided it was time to escalate the psychological pressure slightly. He moved toward the fireplace, crouching and examining the faint mark in the stone, pretending to search for a dropped item. "Interesting," he muttered aloud. "You'd think something so deliberate would leave a more obvious trace. Yet these things are rarely as simple as they seem." He allowed his gaze to sweep the room slowly, resting ever so slightly on Wallace. The butler's posture stiffened, a small bead of sweat forming at the temple despite the cool Highland air. Hamish could see it all: the subtle avoidance of eye contact, the micro-shifts in body language, the internal battle between maintaining composure and revealing truth. Innerly, Hamish introduced a slight challenge. If only someone had taken note of every tiny detail, every minor eye, regularity. I suspect this mystery might have been solved much sooner. He let the statement hang in the air, vague but pointed. Wallace shifted in his seat again, and this time he almost imperceptibly touched the edge of the mantelpiece, brushing against the mark Hamish had identified. It was enough, a small instinctive gesture that betrayed familiarity, a subconscious link to the hidden clue Hamish had observed. The rest of the household said nothing, unaware of the subtle drama playing out. Margaret and Mrs. MacLaren waited, careful to maintain decorum, while Andrew's attention was divided between the detective and the silent tension emanating from Wallace. Hamish Macbeth, sensing the crucial crack in the carefully maintained facade, allowed himself a quiet inward nod. The unconventional clue, the manipulation of perception, the coaxing of instinctive reactions, had done what meticulous observation alone could not. Somewhere in that moment, hidden in the tiniest flickers of movement and expression, the real culprit had revealed the first true sign of their deception, and Hamish knew the path to the final revelation had begun. He house felt unnervingly quiet that evening, the fading light slipping through the tall windows and casting long, shifting shadows across the polished floorboards. Hamish Macbeth was reviewing his notes once more, carefully mapping Wallace's subtle reactions against the web of past grievances and hidden motives he had been piecing together. The Black Knight rested on the mantelpiece, a silent witness to the detective's observations, and the faint mark in the stone hearth remained a persistent clue, hinting at a concealed action yet to be uncovered. Everything was aligning, until it wasn't. Sudden commotion erupted from the study. One of the constables, face pale and voice tight, reported that the drawer Hamish had examined so meticulously the previous evening, the one containing fragments of letters and correspondence, had been tampered with. Papers were scattered, and the most crucial item, a torn note linking Wallace's family history to Sir Alister's inheritance disputes, had vanished entirely. Hamish's stomach tightened. Whoever had taken it had acted quickly and deliberately, erasing a piece of the puzzle that had promised to illuminate the killer's motive. He moved into the room with measured steps, eyes scanning every surface. Nothing else seemed disturbed, yet the absence of that single note altered the balance of the investigation. The envelope, once empty but suggestive, the Black Knight, and now this vanishing correspondence, they all pointed to someone who understood the importance of controlling perception, someone who could anticipate the movements of authorities and the methods of the detective. Hamish's mind raced. The culprit was not merely reactive but proactive, manipulating the investigation even from the shadows. He turned to Wallace, who was standing stiffly near the hearth, ostensibly examining the bookshelves. There was a flicker of something in the butler's eyes, a shadow, almost imperceptible but enough to catch Hamish's trained attention. When asked casually about the missing note, Wallace's composure wavered for a fraction of a second, a tiny hitch in his otherwise meticulous demeanour. He claimed ignorance, his voice steady, but his hands betraying a subtle tremor. Hamish noted every micro-expression, the tightening of the jaw, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, the brief hesitation before answering. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a thread, delicate and frayed, that could be followed. Margaret and Mrs. McLaren exchanged glances, faces carefully neutral but their tension palpable. Hamish knew instinctively that they were aware of the theft, whether by observation or rumour, but their silence suggested fear more than complicity. Even Andrew, who had been under suspicion before, appeared uneasy, shifting weight from foot to foot, as though uncertain what to say or how much to reveal. Trust in the house had become fragile, a delicate lattice threatened by a single deliberate act of concealment. Hamish retraced his steps, inspecting the study for overlooked clues. The ashtray still slightly misaligned, the subtle scuff marks along the rug, even the tilt of the chessboard. All hinted at someone moving carefully, deliberately, ensuring that only select traces were left behind. The missing note was not a mere theft. It was a signal, a warning. The perpetrator had the knowledge, the timing, and the confidence to intervene before the detective could connect the dots fully. It was an escalation, a demonstration of control. The detective gathered the household once more, allowing the tension to simmer while observing the interplay of reactions. Margaret's hands twisted nervously in her apron. Mrs. McLaren's expression remained taut, and Wallace's eyes, though outwardly calm, flicked repeatedly toward the hearth. Hamish could feel the shifting balance of power, the invisible line between observation and deception. Whoever had removed the note understood that panic and misdirection could fracture even the closest scrutiny, and that human fear was often more effective than any weapon. Hamish placed the Black Knight deliberately back on the side table, letting it gleam faintly in the last rays of sunlight. He addressed the room, his voice calm, measured, but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "Curious," he said softly, "how the smallest items can vanish when least expected. Sometimes what disappears is more important than what remains." He watched the faces around him, noting micro-expressions, tiny shifts, and the subtle tightening of muscles. The vanishing evidence had elevated the stakes, leaving the detective with only fragments to follow, and a growing certainty that the real killer remained not only at large, but cunningly aware of the investigation's every turn. Hamish stepped back, his eyes sweeping over the household once more. The air was thick with unspoken questions and quiet apprehension. He understood now that the investigation was no longer a simple matter of observation. It was a test of patience, perception, and intuition. The missing note, the calculated disappearance of evidence, and the fragile trust binding the household together all pointed to a mind several steps ahead, one determined to manipulate the game until only the final decisive move remained, and Hamish Macbeth, steadfast and perceptive, resolved that he would be ready. The night settled over Loch Dhu like a velvet shroud, thick and almost suffocating, and Hamish Macbeth sat in the dim light of the study, reviewing his notes and retracing the threads of motive and deception. The Black Knight remained in its place, the fireplace hearth still bearing its faint enigmatic mark, and yet the stolen note lingered in his mind, a silent warning that the real culprit was far from trapped. Hamish's instincts had never been more alert. A sudden knock at the front door jolted him from his thoughts. He opened it to find a constable, breathless, eyes wide with urgency. "Sir, there's been an incident," the man stammered. "Mrs. McLaren, she's missing from the kitchen, and the pantry. It's been ransacked. There's blood." Hamish's heart quickened. He grabbed his coat and rushed toward the kitchen, the cool night air biting at his cheeks. The scene that greeted him was chaotic: overturned chairs, broken crockery, and smears of blood leading toward the back door. Mrs. McLaren was gone. A window had been forced open, the latch twisted violently. Hamish followed the trail of red, noting every detail: the drag marks, the footprints in the garden soil, the disturbed flower beds. Whoever had taken her had done so with speed and precision, leaving only the faintest traces for those who knew where to look. E called for reinforcements, but even as the constables scurried to secure the perimeter, Hamish realized the cruel truth: the villain was still several steps ahead. This was no random act. The disappearance had been calculated, designed to unsettle, to send a clear message that the killer could strike again at will. Hamish's mind raced, connecting dots with a grim clarity. The first murder, the vanishing note, and now this abduction. It all pointed to someone who thrived on manipulation, who knew the precise moments to create fear and distraction. Hamish retraced Mrs. McLaren's last movements. She had been preparing the evening meal, moving between pantry and kitchen, when she had been interrupted. The blood smears suggested a brief struggle, enough to injure, but not prolonged enough to be careless. Whoever had taken her had expected her to resist, had anticipated the need to leave misleading marks, perhaps to suggest a theft gone wrong rather than a targeted act. Hamish's stomach tightened at the thought. The stakes had just escalated. Turned to Wallace, standing near the hearth, calm yet watchful. The butler's hands were clasped tightly, and his eyes darted toward the back door, measuring the scene. Hamish noted a subtle flicker in his expression, a momentary tension that spoke volumes. Wallace's knowledge of the household's layout, his awareness of hidden exits, and his long familiarity with the routines of the staff all suggested the possibility that he knew more than he admitted. Hamish allowed the thought to linger, careful not to give away the suspicion too openly. The detective's next step was immediate and deliberate. He ordered constables to search the surrounding grounds, while he combed the house for any overlooked signs, a partially closed drawer, a loose tile, a misplaced key. The Black Knight caught his eye again, almost haunting him with its silent presence. It had always symbolized strategy and foresight, and now, in the wake of this sudden development, Hamish understood that the killer was treating this investigation as a game, one in which he was deliberately testing the detective's patience and observation. As he moved through the estate, Hamish reflected on the psychological pattern. The first murder had been symbolic, the vanishing note a calculated misdirection, and now the abduction, an escalation meant to provoke fear, disorient the household, and force errors. The killer's mind was methodical, intelligent, and cruelly deliberate, and Hamish knew that every move he made must be equally precise. He could not afford to be reactionary. He had to anticipate, to predict the next step before it was executed. By midnight, the household was gathered once more, tense and uncertain. Hamish addressed them calmly, carefully observing their reactions. Andrew shifted in his chair, Margaret's hands trembled, and Wallace's gaze was fixed on the darkened back garden, calculating. The abduction had revealed something the detective had not anticipated. The villain was audacious, bold enough to strike even in the heart of the estate, confident that the net would not close in time. Hamish's mind raced, piecing together the possibilities, knowing the next hours would be critical. The game had shifted. No longer was he merely uncovering a crime, he was now in a race to prevent another. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, every subtle hesitation could carry the key to finding Mrs. McLaren and stopping the perpetrator before the killer claimed another victim. Hamish Macbeth, undeterred yet acutely aware of the stakes, felt the familiar, taut thrill of pursuit. The villain had revealed their audacity, and the detective would need all his skill, patience, and insight to meet it. Hamish Macbeth spent the next morning moving methodically through the estate, retracing every path Mrs. McLaren might have taken, examining each room with meticulous care, and reviewing the observations he had made over the past days. The chaos of the abduction had unsettled the household, but to Hamish it offered clarity. The killer's audacity, the carefully staged misdirections, and the vanished note were not random acts. They were deliberate, calculated moves in a larger strategy. Somewhere among the minutiae of the estate and the behaviours of its occupants lay the pattern he needed to see. He walked through the hallways. Hamish's eyes fell on the chessboard once more. The pieces were arranged in mid-game, but curiously, the Black Knight remained slightly out of position. It had caught his attention before, but now he noticed the faint scratch along the edge of the table, a mark that seemed to correspond precisely with the knight's displacement. A memory surfaced, the subtle reactions Wallace had exhibited during the psychological test the night before, the way his hands had twitched toward the mantelpiece, brushing against the hearth's mark. Hamish bent closer, tracing the line with his finger. The knight's position, the scratch, even the scuff marks on the rug were deliberate, forming a code, a sequence that only someone with Sir Alistair's routines could manipulate. Then it clicked. The pattern was not in the objects themselves, but in their placement relative to the household's habitual movements. Each clue, the envelope, the Black Knight, the misplaced letters, Even the vanishing note was aligned along the paths taken by Wallace and the staff over the past week. The killer had used the environment as a map, marking actions, signaling familiarity, and manipulating appearances, all while hiding in plain sight. The abstraction of chaos now resolved itself into a tangible, comprehensible order. Hamish's mind turned to Wallace again. The butler's long tenure, his intimate knowledge of the estate, and his precise, almost ritualistic behavior now fit seamlessly into the emerging pattern. Every deviation Wallace had shown, the subtle tension when discussing letters, the micro-expression when the Black Knight was mentioned, the small gestures toward the hearth, aligned with the orchestrated markers Hamish had identified. Wallace had been treating the investigation like a game of chess, each move calculated to mislead, each reaction carefully controlled, and yet, like any human, he could not fully mask instinctive responses, and it was in those tiny, overlooked moments that the truth revealed itself. Hamish returned to the room where the note had vanished. He carefully examined the drawer, the hearth, and the surrounding furniture, following the trail of prior observations. Then he noticed a small smudge on the underside of the desk, a fingerprint faint but present, partially wiped. It corresponded to the same hand that had left the subtle scuff marks on the rug and adjusted the chessboard's knight. A chill ran down Hamish's spine. The evidence had been there all along, concealed by routine, overlooked in the haste of conventional investigation, but entirely visible to a patient observer, and the abduction of Mrs. MacLaren now fit into the pattern. The routes she could have taken, the timing of her disappearance, and the minor disturbances in the kitchen and garden, all aligned with Wallace's knowledge of the estate and its vulnerabilities. The villain had engineered each event to provoke misdirection and fear, but in doing so had repeated certain habits, revealing the consistent thread linking past grievances, present actions, and now the escalating danger. Hamish stepped back, letting the weight of realization settle. The killer had been sending signals all along, confident that observers would misinterpret them. Each seemingly minor object, gesture, or misplaced item was a message, a move in a game that the perpetrator believed no one could decode. And yet, through careful observation, patience, and attention to human instinct, the code had unraveled. The web of deception, the misaligned pieces, the vanished notes, the abduction, all now made sense as deliberate, interconnected elements. For the first time since the investigation began, Hamish felt the surge of clarity that came when chaos resolves into order. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the pathway to the final confrontation became visible. Wallace's meticulous orchestration, once hidden behind layers of fear, misdirection, and human frailty, was now exposed in its entirety. Hamish Macbeth knew the next steps. The culmination of the case was approaching, and with the pattern revealed, he could prepare to corner the killer before any further harm was done. Hamish Macbeth spent the night in quiet reflection, tracing the pattern he had discerned earlier and replaying the subtle cues, gestures, and objects that had gone unnoticed by the rest of the household. The evidence had finally coalesced into a coherent sequence. Each act, each misdirection, each vanished piece of correspondence was deliberate, calculated, and symbolic. Yet Hamish knew that uncovering the killer's psychology required more than observation. It required understanding the motive that had driven someone to manipulate, terrorize, and ultimately murder. He returned to the study at dawn, letting his eyes sweep over the room with renewed focus. The Black Knight, the tilted portrait, the scratch on the desk, even the faint smudges on the hearth. All these were part of a choreography. But why? Hamish considered Wallace, standing near the fireplace with a calm exterior but taut shoulders and restless eyes. He had long suspected the butler, but now it was time to probe deeper, to understand why Wallace would go to such extremes. Hamish began with a question designed not to confront but to evoke. "Wallace, tell me about your first days with the Mackenzies. What did you admire most about Sir Alistair?" Wallace's eyes flickered, a momentary lapse of composure betraying a hidden depth of feeling. He spoke carefully, recalling Sir Alistair's intelligence, his charm, and his meticulous nature. But then his voice dropped, a tremor betraying an undercurrent of resentment. Hamish pressed subtly, encouraging reflection without accusation. "I've served this family for decades," Wallace admitted quietly, "seen them rise and fall, watched the smallest slights punished while the smallest successes were lauded. Sir Alistair, he trusted everyone but himself, or so it seemed, and sometimes the things he admired, I could not admire in the same way." His gaze drifted toward the black knight on the mantelpiece, and Hamish realized he was looking not at an object, but at a symbol of control, strategy, and dominance. The knight represented not just a game, but the exact dynamic that Wallace had endured for years, a life measured by someone else's rules, every move scrutinized, every misstep judged. Hamish's insight deepened as he listened. This was no ordinary grievance about money, inheritance, or petty jealousy. Wallace had been motivated by a profound psychological compulsion, a need to assert control where he had long been denied it, to reclaim a sense of agency over a life dictated by the meticulous, almost authoritarian structure of the Mackenzies' household. Every act of deception, every staged clue, every calculated disappearance had been designed to shift the balance of power, to demonstrate mastery over an environment where he had been subservient for decades. He stole a note. The abduction of Mrs. MacLaren, the carefully orchestrated false leads, they were all expressions of this hidden motive. Wallace had not merely sought to eliminate Sir Alistair, he had orchestrated a game, a demonstration of intellectual superiority, a means to prove that he could manipulate outcomes, people, and perception with precision. The crime was an assertion of self in a life where he had been invisible, a violent symphony conducted with patience and foresight. Hamish noted how Wallace's meticulous nature had allowed him to exploit the weaknesses in human attention, the eagerness of some, the caution of others, the fear that hesitation breeds. The psychological insight was chilling. Wallace's crime was less about opportunity than about proving, both to himself and to the household, that he could control the narrative entirely. Every fear induced, every clue planted, every misdirection executed, had been a deliberate exercise in dominance and intellect. And the vanishing note now made perfect sense. It had not been merely a missing piece of evidence, it had been a calculated test to see whether anyone could discern its significance. The black knight, the tilted portrait, the scuff marks, and the hearth's subtle scratches were all symbols, part of a ritual of assertion that demonstrated Wallace's ability. Thank you to command attention, mislead, and manipulate the environment to his own ends. Hamish took a slow breath, letting the depth of understanding settle. The motive was hidden in plain sight, embedded in the interplay between human psychology, environmental control, and a compulsion for intellectual mastery. Wallace had committed murder not solely for wealth, power, or revenge, but to assert dominance over a life in which he had been long constrained, to prove that subtlety and strategy could outweigh brute force and conventional authority. Now, with the hidden motive illuminated, the path to resolution became clear. Hamish understood not only what Wallace had done, but why he had been willing to go to such extremes, how every misdirection, every staged clue, and every act of terror was driven by a profound need for control. The detective's mind, calm yet keen, turned toward the final moves, knowing that comprehension of the villain's psychology was the key to ending the deadly game and restoring order to the fractured household of Lochdu. Hamish Macbeth spent the day preparing, every detail deliberate, every precaution calculated. He knew that the final confrontation with Wallace could not be rushed. The butler's intelligence, patience, and understanding of the household's rhythms made him a formidable opponent. Yet Hamish had pieced together the pattern, understood the hidden motive, and traced the psychological markers with precision. All that remained was to draw Wallace into a situation where the web of his own making would collapse around him. That evening, Hamish gathered the household in the drawing-room under the pretence of reviewing the investigation once more. Margaret, still pale and tense from the abduction scare, sat near the fireplace, hands folded tightly in her lap. Andrew lingered by the window, wary yet curious, while Mrs. MacLaren, though unharmed, clutched her apron nervously, her eyes darting toward every movement. Wallace, as composed as ever, stood near the hearth, hands behind his back, a faint shadow of anticipation flickering across his face. Hamish spoke calmly, deliberately, recounting the sequence of events as if narrating an old story. He mentioned the vanished note, the abduction, the subtle marks on the chessboard and hearth, and the Black Knight. Each detail was presented neutrally, almost conversationally, yet embedded within them was a subtle demonstration of his knowledge, a signal to Wallace that the detective understood everything. He watched carefully for the smallest reaction. Wallace's hand twitched almost imperceptibly when the Black Knight was mentioned. His eyes flicked toward the hearth's mark, then back to Hamish, a taut line tightening around his mouth. Hamish allowed the moment to linger, letting the tension build naturally, giving Wallace the space to reveal himself. The calm exterior began to crack, and Hamish noticed it in the micro-expressions, a fleeting glare, a shallow intake of breath, a subtle shift in posture. "I imagine," Hamish said softly, "that orchestrating such events must require an extraordinary understanding of people, routines, and expectations. To manipulate, misdirect, and terrify, all with such precision." He paused, letting his words hang, deliberate in their implication. Wallace's hands clenched slightly, but he remained outwardly still. "The smallest details often reveal the largest truths," Hamish continued, stepping closer to the hearth, gesturing toward the faint mark. "The movements, the objects, the patterns, they speak volumes to those who know how to listen. And I have listened, Wallace. Every micro-expression, every gesture, every deviation has told me the story I needed to hear." Wallace's composure finally broke. His shoulders sagged slightly, a sharp exhale escaping him, though his voice remained controlled. "And what, then, is the conclusion you have drawn?" he asked, curiosity mingling with faint defensiveness. "That the games, the false leads, the manipulation of fear, all of it has been—" "Very instructive," Hamish said gently, his eyes never leaving Wallace's. "But it has also been telling. You've been remarkably careful, but even the most meticulous patterns contain small fissures. And those fissures lead to the truth." Wallace's gaze darted toward the window, then to the door, a subtle calculation passing across his face. For a moment Hamish thought the butler might attempt to flee, to make one last desperate move, but instead Wallace's expression hardened, resignation mingling with a quiet pride. "I suppose it was inevitable that someone would see," he said, his voice low, carrying a blend of acknowledgement and defiance. Hamish stepped closer, calmly producing the Black Knight from the table, letting it rest between them. "It was not mere chance," he said. "Every act, every misdirection, every disappearance, you wanted to prove control. But control over actions and perception is never absolute. The truth, however well concealed, always surfaces." Wallace's hands unclasped slowly, a subtle sign of surrender. "Then you have me," he said almost softly. "Yes, it was all to prove that I could orchestrate a story in which I alone held the strings. I wanted to show that even the most trusted man could be undermined, subtly, inexorably, without detection until the end." Hamish nodded, maintaining calm, his stance composed yet firm. "And now the end has come," he said. "No one else need fear, and the web of deception is finally undone." He signalled to the constables, who moved silently to secure Wallace. There was no struggle, no desperate attempt to escape. The meticulous butler had run out of options, his carefully constructed game concluded, revealed in full by the patient, unflinching observation of Hamish Macbeth. As Wallace was led away, the detective allowed himself a quiet exhale. The mansion of Lochdu, once tense and fearful, felt lighter, calmer, as if relieved by the resolution. Every object, every mark, every subtle human gesture had been observed, interpreted, and now accounted for. The game had ended, and Hamish Macbeth, as ever, had prevailed, not through force, but through patience, perception, and the unerring attention to the truth hidden in plain sight. The mansion of Lochdu had settled into an uneasy calm. Wallace had been escorted away, the constables ensuring he could not escape, and the household, though visibly relieved, still moved with careful, tentative steps. Hamish Macbeth lingered in the drawing-room, reviewing the chain of events, the carefully mapped motives, and the patterns that had led to the butler's confession. The investigation, by all appearances, was concluded, yet Hamish's instincts, honed over years of subtle observation, whispered caution. Something felt unresolved, a lingering imbalance in the web of clues that he could not yet name. He walked slowly through the house, letting his eyes sweep over every familiar surface. The black night on the mantelpiece caught the light, gleaming faintly, and Hamish paused, considering it. It had been central to Wallace's psychological game, a symbol of his desire for control, yet it also carried a minor detail he had overlooked in the rush of confrontation. A faint scratch on its underside, matching a small mark on the hearth. But the scratch seemed newer, sharper than he remembered. That micro-anomaly nagged at him, pulling his attention toward a possibility he had not yet entertained. Returning to the study, Hamish examined the shelves where correspondence had been stored, re-inspecting every drawer and envelope. The missing note, long assumed to have been removed by Wallace, still had no confirmed resting place. And then, as he lifted a small, inconspicuous ledger from a lower shelf, a folded scrap of paper slipped from between the pages. Hamish caught it instinctively, unfolding it with care. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, deliberate, and unfamiliar to him. It referenced the estate, the timing of Sir Alister's murder, and, most disturbingly, the placement of the Black Knight and other staged clues. Hamish's mind raced. The handwriting was not Wallace's. This implied that Wallace had been a tool, perhaps manipulated by someone else who understood both the household and Wallace's psychology. The careful orchestration of the crime, the vanishing note, the abduction of Mrs. MacLaren, and even Wallace's confession could all have been elements in a plan devised by another mind entirely, someone who had remained in plain sight while Wallace acted as the visible culprit. He gathered the household quietly, explaining nothing, only observing as he presented the note on the table. Margaret leaned forward, curiosity mingling with fear. Andrew's hand tightened on the window frame. Mrs. MacLaren's eyes widened, but it was Wallace who drew the sharpest scrutiny. He had not been informed of this note. Hamish's gaze swept over the room, then fixed on Andrew. It was a moment of clarity. The younger man, though previously anxious under questioning, now exhibited a subtle shift, a twitch of recognition at the handwriting. The pattern he had overlooked until now became chillingly clear. T.E. note suggested financial details and strategic moves that only someone closely tied to Sir Alister, with access to personal documents and intimate knowledge of the family, could have known. Andrew, eager to protect his uncle's interests earlier, now seemed to have had more motivat. Ion than previously suspected. Hamish considered the long chain of events. Wallace had orchestrated the visible crime, using his knowledge and cunning, but Andrew had provided the underlying strategy, the manipulations that allowed Wallace to act and mislead the authorities so effectively. The younger man's nervous posture, the fleeting glances, and his previously overlooked hesitation now aligned with the notion of a hidden mastermind. Hamish's insight deepened. The abduction, the planted clues, the vanishing note, all of it had been perfectly designed to keep suspicion focused on Wallace, a brilliant diversion. The final twist, hidden in plain sight, revealed that the case was never as straightforward as it seemed. Wallace, the meticulous and careful butler, was not acting entirely on his own. He had been guided, perhaps subtly coerced or persuaded, by someone whose motives had been buried beneath layers of filial loyalty, fear, and opportunity. With calm determination, Hamish approached Andrew, noting every micro-expression, every tightening of muscles, every flicker of hesitation. "It seems, Andrew," he said softly, "that some games are played with multiple players, and while one may be in the spotlight, others can move unseen, orchestrating the moves that guide the outcome." Andrew's face paled, his composure faltering as realization dawned. The game had shifted once more, and Hamish Macbeth, unflinching and methodical, prepared to confront the true architect of the chaos, the final hidden hand that had turned a murder into an intricate, deadly performance. The calm of Lochdu had been shattered once more, but this time the detective's clarity shone brightest. The final revelation was at hand, and the true test of perception, patience, and insight, the ultimate proof of Hamish Macbeth's genius, was about to unfold. Hamish Macbeth studied Andrew carefully, noting subtle cues he had observed, the tension in his shoulders, the repeated avoidance of direct eye contact, the way his hands had unconsciously flexed when Hamish mentioned the note. Slowly, deliberately, Hamish laid out the sequence of events, recounting each act as if narrating a story, yet embedding within the narrative the threads of motive, opportunity, and manipulation that had guided every move. He spoke of Wallace's apparent orchestration, the vanishing note, the abduction of Mrs. MacLaren, and the misdirections that had diverted suspicion, all the while letting his gaze linger on Andrew, whose colour had drained from his face. The pieces were all in place, Hamish said quietly, but not all the hands were visible. Wallace acted with meticulous care, yes, and he understood the household's patterns, the layout, and the daily routines. But the moves themselves, the strategy that made such deception possible, were guided by another. Someone with knowledge of the family, access to documents, and understanding of timing that could only come from within. Andrew shifted uncomfortably, and his attempt to interject faltered. Hamish continued, deliberately exposing the hidden cues. The handwriting on this note, never Wallace's, outlined not just the steps of misdirection, but the timing of the abduction, the placement of objects, and even the subtle psychological tests used to gauge reactions. It was prepared in advance, intended to guide Wallace without leaving direct evidence linking the true architect to the crime. Yet even in your caution, there were slips, small gestures, micro-expressions, moments when instinct betrayed the careful facade. Andrew's eyes flickered toward the window as if considering escape, but Hamish anticipated the thought, stepping subtly to block the line of flight while maintaining a calm, authoritative stance. "I know what you were counting on, Hamish said, voice even but firm. The assumption that Wallace's intelligence and pride could absorb the consequences, that suspicion would never drift to you, and that the house itself would hide your hand. But you underestimated human perception, and you underestimated me." The younger man's composure finally broke. He slumped into a chair, voice low and bitter. "It was supposed to be controlled, everything, calculated. I didn't want anyone hurt, except him. But Wallace, he went further than I anticipated." Hamish noted the confession's careful phrasing. He admitted orchestration, but not total responsibility, leaving Wallace as the public face of the crime, the fall guy in a master plan. Hamish allowed silence to settle, letting the weight of observation and revelation press on the room. "Control is a dangerous illusion," he said finally. "You manipulated, misdirected, and concealed, but the clues were always there. The misaligned chessboard, the marks on the hearth, the vanished note, the reactions of those around you, they were subtle, almost invisible. Yet each acted like a thread, and once traced carefully, the tapestry of deception became clear. Wallace's hand was guided, your hand, though hidden, left an unmistakable pattern. The constables moved to secure Andrew, though the younger man did not resist. The sense of relief in the room was tempered by the knowledge of how close the household had come to disaster, and by the unsettling realization that the game had been far more complex than anyone had imagined. Wallace, though dangerous and cunning, had been acting within a framework imposed by another mind. Now both threads of deception had been accounted for, and justice could at last be formally served. Hamish took a final moment to review the scene, mentally retracing the clues, the objects, the gestures, the inconsistencies, the psychological tests that had initially been overlooked. He allowed himself a quiet, inward satisfaction, not triumph, for the game had been perilous, and the stakes real. Yet even as calm settled over Loch Dhu, he remained alert. Human cunning often left residues of uncertainty, and the echoes of misdirection and subtle manipulation reminded him that the world rarely offered perfect closure. The estate, once tense and fearful, now breathed again under the watchful order restored by careful observation and unerring deduction. Hamish Macbeth, quietly vigilant, reflected on the lessons of perception, patience, and psychology. Every subtlety mattered. every glance carried meaning, and through it all, a detective's calm scrutiny could discern truth hidden even in the most meticulously orchestrated illusion. Justice had been delivered, and yet, as always, the world retained its shadows, a reminder that vigilance and discernment were never truly complete. The morning after the final arrests, Loch Dhu felt quieter than usual, the wind moving gently across the hills, as if the landscape itself were exhaling. Hamish Macbeth walked along the edge of the loch, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, mind quietly sifting through every observation, every gesture, and every clue from the tumultuous days that had passed. The estate behind him had returned to a fragile calm. Wallace and Andrew were in custody. Mrs. Maclaren and the rest of the household were safe, and the meticulously orchestrated murders and abductions had been unravelled. Yet Hamish felt a familiar tug in his chest, a restless awareness that even resolved cases left small shadows in their wake. As he wandered, Hamish's eyes fell on the remnants of frost clinging to the grass, faint tracks in the mud, and the subtle patterns of the wind across the surface of the water. Even in the ordinary he saw fragments of the extraordinary, the tiny details that others overlooked. He considered the note that had revealed Andrew's role, the micro-expressions that had betrayed Wallace, and the objects that had carried hidden meaning. Everything had been explained, everything accounted for, or so it seemed, ND yet. A small nagging discrepancy lingered in his mind. During the confrontation, one minor item had escaped scrutiny, a piece of paper folded and tucked into a drawer that neither Wallace nor Andrew had mentioned. Its presence had not been significant at the time. The detective had focused on the note, the abduction, and the overt manipulations. But the paper had an unusual crease, as if it had been handled in a very particular way, and Hamish remembered the faint smudge of ink along its edge. The origin of that smudge, the handwriting, the subtle fold. It suggested a communication that had taken place entirely outside of the main orchestration of the crime. Someone else, perhaps, had been watching, waiting, or influencing events from the periphery. Hamish let the thought linger, a quiet reminder that even the most meticulous investigations often left threads untied. The pattern, the motive, the final revelation. They had all been traced with precision, yet the small anomaly whisper of possibilities he had not yet explored. He frowned slightly, amused at the detective's eternal dilemma. In solving one puzzle, another always seemed to emerge, a reminder that human cunning was rarely absolute in that perception, and patience were never complete. He turned back toward the estate, noting the household slowly coming to life again. Margaret was tidying the drawing room, her movements deliberate, but her eyes occasionally flicked toward the window, as if still wary of unseen threats. Mrs. Maclaren hummed softly in the kitchen, resuming her routines, yet there was an edge of unease in her otherwise contented movements. The echoes of fear and suspense, while diminished, were not entirely gone. Hamish recognized that in every resolved mystery, the memory of danger lingered, quietly shaping behavior and perception. The loch's edge, a faint ripple disturbed the glassy surface of the water. Hamish paused, squinting toward the far bank, considering the movement. It could have been the wind, a bird, a drifting leaf. But to Hamish, it represented more, the reminder that the world was not static, that unseen forces continued their subtle influence, and that a true detective's vigilance could never be fully suspended. Sometimes the smallest motion, the faintest trace, carried meaning, and sometimes the next story waited just beyond perception. He walked on, the path winding along familiar turf, letting his thoughts organize the events he had witnessed. Each observation, each psychological nuance, each carefully concealed deception had formed a narrative, a deadly game that now lay exposed. Yet the memory of that hidden fold, the smudge of ink, the unexplained crease in the paper, lingered in the back of his mind, a cryptic message, or a minor clue, hinting that the web of human behavior could conceal more than one manipulative mind. As he reached the crest of the hill overlooking Loch Dhu, Hamish paused and gazed at the village below, the morning mist curling around the chimneys, the roads empty except for the occasional figure moving with purpose. He felt the familiar mix of satisfaction and curiosity. The case was resolved, justice had been served, But the world, as always, contained layers yet unexplored, motives yet undetected, and small enigmas that might later bloom into new mysteries. With a final reflective glance, Hamish Macbeth adjusted his coat and continued his walk toward the village, steps measured, mind alert, heart steady. The wind tugged at his hair, carrying the scent of earth and water, the subtle promise that even as one mystery closed, another would eventually arise. And in that quiet awareness, Hamish felt the certainty that his vigilance, patience, and unerring perception would be needed again, because in Loch Dhu, as in life, a mystery never truly ends.